Tanrı'nın varlığına ilişkin ontolojik argüman nedir? Tanrı'nın varlığına ilişkin ilk görüşlerimiz neden önemlidir?
What is the ontological argument for the existence of God? Why are our first sights, prima facie, of God's existence important?
So the ontological argument is a classic argument for the existence of God that attempts to deduce God's existence not from facts about the world like apparent design or contingent objects, but from the very idea or concept of God. So philosophers since Anselm have argued that there's something special about the concept of God, unlike the concept of other things, that has this sort of special ontological implications. So very briefly, Anselm reasoned like this. He says, God is, by definition, the greatest conceivable being. That's the very concept of God. That's what we have in mind when we think of God. So that's the first premise of his argument, is just that we have an idea of the greatest conceivable being, or the most perfect being. But if it's truly the greatest being, then this being wouldn't merely be an idea in our minds, it would be real, since to exist in reality is greater than to exist just as an idea in our minds. So Anselm concludes that the very idea of a greatest being entails that there is a greatest being, not just in our minds, but also in reality outside our minds. So that's kind of the idea of the classic Anselmian version of the ontological argument. And volumes have been written about this argument. Some philosophers arguing that it's the most brilliant argument ever penned, and then others saying that it amounts to no more than just a joke, or it's just pure sophistry. So you get perspectives from very, very diverse or extremes on this argument. And the main criticism of Anselm's argument is that it assumes that existence is a predicate or a property of things in addition to other properties. But the idea is that, well, things sort of exist first and then have properties. Existence is not itself among the properties things have. So Anselm's argument fails. This was Kant's famous criticism of the ontological argument. But it's now widely recognized that there are multiple versions of the ontological argument in Anselm's writings, and some don't depend on this assumption that existence is a predicate. Better versions of the argument need to only assume that necessary existence is a predicate or property. And obviously it is. Things either exist contingently or necessarily. Now we can say that if God exists as a perfect being, God would be a necessary being. It's greater or more perfect to be a necessary being than to be a merely contingent being. Now, here's the interesting point on which the entire argument hinges. It's a valid inference in modal logic, which is the logic of necessity and possibility, that whatever's possibly necessary is necessary. This has huge implications for the ontological argument, since if we agree that God's existence is possible and that it belongs to the concept of God, that God is a necessary being, then we can use this inference in modal logic to conclude that God exists, because what's possibly necessary is necessary, and of course, what's necessary is actual. So the success of the ontological argument all hangs on the question of whether God possibly exists. And so what arguments can be given for this, for the possibility of God's existence? Well, some have attempted proofs or demonstrations of the possibility of God's existence in very rigorous fashion, by showing that all of God's attributes sort of logically hang together in a consistent way with each other, so that it's possible for a being to have them all at once. But those are very ambitious, but more common and less ambitious arguments simply aim to defend the rational permissibility of belief that God's existence is possible. And one argument to this effect that I've explored is based on this rather simple observation that what seems to be the case is good grounds for believing it is the case. So the defender of the ontological argument can then say this: well, it seems possible that God exists, so I have good grounds for believing it is possible that God exists. But one problem with this way of defending the possibility of God's existence is that it seems like the critic can just do the same thing in reverse, right? They could just say, well, it seems possible to me that God does not exist. So I have good grounds for believing it's possible that God does not exist. And so the defender of the argument and the critic of the argument are just sort of, they reach a stalemate. Now, here's where I want to suggest appearances are deceptive. And to see this, we need to get a little more clear perspective on the so-called nature of appears claims or seems claims. Now, as I mentioned above, it's a widely accepted principle in epistemology that if something seems or appears to be the case, well, that's good grounds for believing it is the case. Now, another way of putting this is that if the way things appear is generally good evidence of the way things are, but epistemologists have argued that the reverse is not true. The reverse is not true. So how things seem positively to be is evidence of how things are, but how things seem not to be is not evidence of how things are not, or of how things are. So, for example, the next example might help. If it seems to me that there is no elephant in the room, well, that's evidence for there being no elephant in the room, only if I probably would see an elephant in the room if there were one. So additional grounds are needed to justify belief in the non-existence of things based on the way things seem or appear. Now, I think something like this point can be made in the context of defending the ontological argument to break the stalemate. And here's how we would go about it. So consider more carefully the two claims being made. The defender of the argument says it seems possible that God exists, and then the critic of the argument replies, well, it seems possible that God does not exist. And the claims seem to be on epistemic par, and so the stalemate. But recall that we're assuming that it's possible, we're assuming that it's part of the concept of God, that God, if God exists at all, God is a necessary being. So the defender of the argument is saying something supposedly necessary, God, seems possible. But the critic is actually saying something much stronger. He's saying that something supposedly necessary, God, seems impossible. The apparent modesty of that claim, the initial claim that it seems possible that God does not exist, logically speaking, is actually the much stronger claim that it seems impossible that God exists. So it's not like saying it seems possible that unicorns exist on the one hand, and it seems possible that unicorns don't exist on the other. You know, those two claims do seem like on epistemic par, because unicorns are just contingent beings. Their existence is not either necessary or impossible. But God's existence is either necessary or impossible. So again, the competing claims are, it seems possible that God exists, and it seems impossible that God exists. And the latter claim is much stronger. It's a much stronger claim than the former claim, so they're not on epistemic par. Well, why do I say that the former claim or the latter claim is much stronger? Well, because presumably when someone says something seems impossible to them, it's because they're confronting like a conceptual problem of some kind, like a clear contradiction or some kind of debilitating myopia or opacity that's preventing them from seeing a clear image or an idea in their mind. But if that's the case, we can just simply ask, what is it? What's the problem? In the present case, what is it about the concept of God that seems contradictory or opaque? The critic is the one saying that it seems impossible. So why? Tell me why. That's the question. Or we could put it another way. We put it like this. If something appears possible to you, well, that just means you don't see anything contradictory or unclear about it. It's innocent until proven guilty. But if something does appear impossible to you, well, then presumably you do see something contradictory or unclear about it. And so you should be able to say what that is. Okay, so here's a different example that might kind of help illustrate the point. Suppose I say, there's a barber who shaves all and only those men in town who do not shave themselves. Okay. Is that possible? Well, at first blush, first appearances, you might say so. Yeah, it seems so. I'm imagining a barber. I'm imagining the town. I'm imagining shaving people and so on. I see no problem. So, yeah, seems possible. But then you say, no, that does not seem possible. And so immediately I want to know why. Well, what's problematic about it? Why does it seem impossible to you? And you, being a much smarter person than me, you'll explain that, well, if the barber, who's a man in town, does not shave himself, well, he must shave himself, which is a contradiction. So it seems impossible then that the barber who shaves all and only those men in town who do not shave themselves. Ah, I see now. Yes, that's right. But without seeing that contradiction, I had no grounds for thinking it was impossible. Appearances of possibility are innocent until proven guilty. So the underlying principle here is something like this. I am prima facie justified at face value or at first blush. I'm prima facie justified in believing P is possible based upon its appearing possible to me, if and only if it's reasonable to believe that if P were impossible, it would probably appear impossible upon further reflection. And this seems to be exactly what happened in the Barber case. Upon further reflection, a contradiction was uncovered, thereby removing the initial appearances of possibility. So, returning to the ontological argument, we can say, it appears to me that God possibly exists. And so, when we apply this principle, we get, it is reasonable for me to believe that if it is impossible that God exists, it would probably appear impossible that God exists upon further reflection. But it doesn't. And so far, I haven't seen anyone who has successfully pointed out a contradiction in the concept of God or successfully argued that the concept of God is like irredeemably unclear in some way. So, on the contrary, the concept of God has been articulated with pristine clarity. So, I can sort of finish off the argument by saying, well, I am prima facie justified in believing God possibly exists. And if I'm prima facie justified in believing God possibly exists, I'm justified in believing God does exist. So I'm justified in believing God does exist. So to wrap it up, then, one defense of the key premise of the ontological argument, which is that God's existence is possible, God possibly exists, is that it seems to me that God possibly exists. And the objection that the critic can, in turn, just with equal justification, say the opposite, well, that turns out to be false, or at least not obviously true at all, because the two claims are not on an epistemic par, because one is a claim to an appearance of possibility, which I say are innocent until proven guilty, and the other is a claim to an appearance of impossibility, which is a much stronger claim and in need of additional support.